Well, President Trump is set to meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday, and the meeting comes amid ongoing fighting in Gaza after Israel resumed its bombardment of the Strip when ceasefire negotiations stalled last month. Now Netanyahu says Israel has plans to divide up Gaza and seize control of certain areas. This, as a senior Palestinian official says, Hamas is now prepared to release all the remaining hostages at once in exchange for a permanent ceasefire, or at the very least, release of a number of hostages as part of a renewed temporary ceasefire. But Hamas also wants guarantees that Israel will agree to enter negotiations on ending the war, which so far Netanyahu has refused to do. Netanyahu will be the first world leader to visit President Trump at the White House since the new tariffs went into place. And earlier on NewsNation, we welcome retired Marine Intelligence Officer Hal Kempfer for insights into this upcoming meeting.
Actually, the context of the war in Gaza seems to overlay the meeting, but Netanyahu was actually up in Hungary meeting with Viktor Orban, and then he's flying directly over there to Washington, D.C. And of course, first on the agenda is that 17% tariff that the U.S. has put on Israel. Israel is by far the largest export customer, if you will, of Israel. About 25% of their exports come to the U.S. Of course, we also send a lot of things over there, not the least of which is weapon systems. So getting this worked out, and of course, part of it is that Netanyahu said he'd drop everything, go down to zero on tariffs, and the numbers that President Trump showed weren't exactly tariff numbers. They were more of a reflection of trade deficit numbers, a little mathematical calculation. So there's a lot of work to be done to get down that zero. But if there was to be a first country that we come to an agreement with, Israel might be that first country.
Yeah. Well, important context there. I appreciate you sharing that. Back to the war efforts here. Netanyahu, as you know, he's facing a lot of political pressure in his home country. With Hamas now expressing this willingness to release all remaining Israeli hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire, apparently, how do you think that willingness may shape the conversation with President Trump on Monday?
Well, they're going to have a big discussion on that. Of course, right now on the streets of the major cities in Israel, there's big protests saying, hey, just take the deal, take the deal. But the U.S., Israel, and interestingly, the Arab nations led by Egypt have all agreed that Hamas will not be in a governance role once a peace agreement or permanent ceasefire, once that's agreed to, they will not be in charge. The other thing is Israel said that Hamas needs to lay down its arms. And of course, for Hamas, at some point they hit an existential crisis, which is, what are they if they're not an armed resistance to Israel? So there's a lot of work to be done here. My guess would be that they're going to come over and come to an agreement, and it might be to push for a ceasefire. I would be surprised if it's a peace agreement, a permanent ceasefire, but there might be some push to get something done just to get those hostages released.
You know, we have about 30 seconds left, and I appreciate that explanation. The Wall Street Journal reported that privately Israeli officials complained to Washington about that accidental inclusion of a journalist in that secure group chat about U.S. military plans to strike the Houthis. This was a development that took place since these two have last met. Do you think it will be addressed head-on Monday?
I think it'll be addressed. I think they're going to try and avoid saying anything publicly about it. But of course, everything that's been reported is that the source of what Mike Waltz talked about, not Secretary Hegseth, but Mike Waltz talked about, the source of that, that the target had walked into the girlfriend's home before the attack, that actually was Israeli intelligence. And of course, it's not known what that source is, but certainly if there was a human source on the ground, something like that getting released puts that human source in certainly grave jeopardy, to say the least. And Israel is very upset about this. So I imagine that's going to be discussed very strongly by Bibi Netanyahu.
Thanks so much for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.